we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 10, where Daniel tells us about another of his visions here at the end of the book. And if you missed any of the previous 9 chapters of Daniel, that's okay. They're all available on YouTube, Facebook. You can watch them, at your convenience if you want to catch up. They're there. But we're going to be in Daniel chapter 10, and we'll pick up in verse 1. In the year of King Cyrus of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. The message was true and was about a great conflict. He understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. In those days, Daniel was mourning for 3 full weeks. I didn't eat any rich food. No meat or wine entered my mouth. I didn't put any oil on my body until the 3 weeks were over. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing in the bank of the great river, the Tigris, and actually, by the way, the background picture is the Tigris River. I figured that would be good to put that in. Now, I don't know where, Tigris is a long river, so where exactly Daniel was standing, this is actually probably further in the northern part, but anyway, that is the Tigris River. Verse 5, I looked up, and there was a man dressed in linen with a belt of gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, and his face like the brilliance of lightning. His eyes like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sounds of his words like the sound of a multitude. Only I, Daniel, saw the vision. The men who were with me did not see it, but a great terror fell on them, and they ran and hid. I was left alone. Looking at this great vision, no strength was left in me. My face grew deathly pale, and I was powerless. I heard the words he said, and when I heard them, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Suddenly, a hand touched me and set me shaking on my hands and knees. He said to me, Daniel, you are a man treasured by God. Understand the words that I'm saying to you. Stand on your feet, for I have been sent to you. After he said this to me, I stood trembling. Don't be afraid, Daniel, he said to me, for from the first day that you proposed to understand and to humble yourself before God, your prayers were heard. I have come because of your prayers. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me after I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Now I have come to help you and understand what will happen, to help you understand what will happen to your people in the last days, for the vision refers to those days. While he was saying these words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and was speechless. Suddenly, one with the human likeness touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and said to the one standing in front of me, My Lord, because of this vision, anguish overwhelms me, and I am powerless. How can someone like me, your servant, speak with someone like you, my Lord? I have no strength, and there is no breath in me. Then the one with a human appearance touched me again and strengthened me. He said, Don't be afraid, you who are treasured by God. Peace to you, be very strong. And he spoke to me and strengthened me and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. I was strengthened and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. He said, Do you know why I've come to you? I must return at once to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I leave, the prince of Greece will come. However, I will tell you what is recorded in the book of truth. No one has the courage to support me against those princes except Michael, your prince. In the first year of Darius the Mede, this is chapter 11, verse 1, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to strengthen and protect him. Now this passage kind of continues on into the next chapter, and we'll look at that next week. when we get there. But what we're going to focus on today is the actual being that appears to Daniel and his message to him, and the interpretation we'll look at next week. So in the third year of Cyrus, King Cyrus, who had taken over after the Persians had conquered the Babylonians, Daniel has a troubling vision. He sees this vision of the future, which is what these last couple chapters of the book are about, and he has this troubling vision. And really this chapter that we're looking at will just deal with the person coming to explain it. Next week we'll look at the explanation of the actual troubling vision he had. But Daniel sees this vision. He's greatly troubled, so much that he went into a form of fasting, of mourning and praying for 3 weeks. He takes the time to get serious with God because of what he'd seen. And that's a reasonable thing for him to do. In fact, let's go ahead and look again at verse 2 and 3. He says, "In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 full weeks." Whatever it was that he saw in this vision, it actually put him in a state of mourning over what was to come. He didn't like what he saw. Verse 3, he said, "And I didn't eat any rich food, no meat or wine entered my mouth, and I didn't put on any oil on my body until the 3 weeks were over." And so Daniel says here he didn't eat any rich food. Some translations will say he didn't eat any tasty food or pleasant food. He ate neither meat nor wine, and he didn't put any oil on himself for those 3 weeks. You might think of it as, no meat, no wine, no tasty food. He was a vegan for 3 weeks. That's basically, kind of a rough gig. And the oil thing, you might think of it in our culture as using lotion or deodorant. I don't know if you would think about mourning before God so much that you're not putting on any hand lotion for 3 weeks. That may seem a strange concept, but that's kind of what they would use oil as a lotion. They would also use it as a perfume and as a deodorant. So he's not using any of that. Everything basically, he went dry and plain, basic living. We should understand there are different types of fasting. Often when we talk about fasting, we think of just strictly the not eating of anything, or maybe even the not drinking anything. But you can fast from certain things. Daniel would be a good example of this. And during this time, he lives in mourning. He humbles himself before God, and he lives a simple life with no luxuries, a simple life with no amenities. Basically, he eats to survive. He does what he has to do to function, but he doesn't pamper himself. Why? Because his life, he wants to focus everything on seeking God's answer to this vision. God has let him in on what's coming in the future, and he wants to focus on that, not just go back to life as usual. Do we do that? See, when we've had a spiritual encounter, when we've had God show us something, do we lay hold of it, pursuing God's answer in our life above all else? That's what Daniel did. Or do we just return to normal? Oh, God, thank you for showing me this stuff. I appreciate it, but hey, it's dinner time. Don't interrupt my deodorant, guys. Don't make my life difficult. See, are we willing to humble ourselves before God, to set aside the temporary things of this world in order to participate in His eternal kingdom? And twice in this passage, Daniel is told he is treasured by God. I think the reason we see this dynamic in Daniel's life is in Daniel's life, God was first. He would put everything else aside to put God first. But see, I think often the love of our comforts becomes an obstacle and keeps us from greater spiritual understanding. Guys, we like to be comfortable. Now, I'm not even talking about, often we say, I can't fast, I can't go hungry. Daniel didn't go without food. He went without tasty food. Maybe the issue isn't even going hungry. The issue is, are you willing to put God first where you're not going to worry about your delicacies, your pleasures, and you're just going to make God first? Actually, I did do once, believe it or not, I lived 21 days as a vegan. It was a trying time in my life, but yeah, it was rough. But it's called the Daniel Fast. There's actually, you can get a book on it and everything. It's called the Daniel Fast, and it's kind of the idea of eating only basically raw foods, basic vegetables and fruits, and you don't eat anything that's processed or prepared or sweetened, or it's kind of a thing. And I will say it was probably the healthiest diet I ever ate. 21 days on it, I actually was feeling pretty good, but I sure was craving pizza. You know what I'm saying? Because that's not on the diet. But I will say I ate normal and lost weight. I didn't eat the normal foods, but I ate normal meat-sized meals, and so it was good. But I think we often get sidetracked. Anyway, Daniel prays, and God answers. That's what we see in this passage. Daniel prays. He goes to God. He sets aside everything for 21 days, for 3 weeks. He is praying to God, and God answers. Now, isn't it funny how that works? See, James tells us this. Remember what James says? He says, you do not have because you do not ask. And so often, the reason we don't see God intervening in our life, the reason we don't get an answer is because we don't take the time to ask. Daniel did ask, and Daniel did receive, and what happens is we see a majestic being appear to him here at the Tigris River. In fact, he's out there with other guys. I'm assuming he's working. He's doing his normal job. He's still having his time of prayer, just like always, but he's making God first, but he's still continuing on with what he has to do, and this being appears to him at the Tigris River and explains the vision. We'll look at the explanation of the vision next week. But before we get to that explanation as to what's going to happen in the future, first he tells what's happening in the present. That's what we're going to look at this week. What we're going to focus on today. He tells him what was happening behind the scenes. Wouldn't you like to know what's happening behind the scenes in the spiritual realms of today? Wouldn't that be interesting to know? That is the glimpse that Daniel gets. The spiritual realm of his day. What's happening behind the scenes. And this being appears to him, and it's actually a very interesting being that appears. Let's go ahead and look at that for a moment. In Daniel chapter 10, verse 5, this being has appeared to Daniel in response to his prayer. It says this, I looked up, and there was a man dressed in linen with a belt of gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, and beryl is kind of like a crystal. It can come in a lot of different colors, but it's like a crystal. His face was like the brilliance of lightning, and his eyes like the flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. Only I, Daniel, saw the vision. The men who were with me did not see it, but great terror fell on them, and they ran and hid. Excuse me. I was left alone, looking at the great vision. No strength was left in me. My face grew deathly pale, and I was powerless. I heard the words he said, and then when I heard them, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. A question I kind of hit as I was reading this is, who is this being? Who is this who appears to Daniel? He wears a linen robe with a gold belt. His face shines like lightning. His eyes like torches. His hands and feet were like bronze. His voice is like a multitude speaking. His presence is so terrifying that even those who didn't see him ran away in fear. And Daniel, who does see him, falls face down on the ground and passes out and has no strength. And the description sounds familiar. In fact, there's a description that I think kind of comes close. We looked at, a couple years back. This is in Revelation chapter 1, verse 12. The Apostle John says this. This is what he writes when Jesus appears to him. He says, Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstand was one like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe, with a golden sash wrapped around his chest. The hair of his head was white like wool, white as snow, and his eyes like the fiery flame. His feet were like fine bronze, as it is fired in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of cascading waters. He had 7 stars in his right hand, and a sharp double-edged sword came from his mouth, and his face was shining like the sun at full strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man. And he laid his right hand on me and said, "Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last, the living one. I was dead, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Therefore write what you have seen, what is, and what will take place after this." Do those two sound kind of similar? Sounds pretty close. In terms of the actual description we're given, it sounds pretty close. And so I think we cannot rule out the possibility that the being that appears to Daniel is Jesus. This would be a pre-incarnate manifestation of the second person of the Trinity. That's a real technical way of saying it's a place where Jesus shows up in the Old Testament, okay? He's eternal, so he can do that if he wants to. Now that's a possibility. I'm not saying it's an absolute. I'm just saying when I read the description that Daniel gives of this being that appears to him, and then I read the description of Jesus that John gives in Revelation, they sure sound an awful lot alike. On the other hand, there are angels who also have an extremely awesome appearance. This is in Revelation chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. John writes this, he says, "Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun, his legs were like pillars of fire, and he held the scroll open in his hand, and he put his right foot on the sea and his left on the land, and he called out with a loud voice like a roaring lion, and he cried out, and the 7 thunders raised their voices." And so, while I think the description, the closest description we have anywhere else in Scripture that comes to it is the description of Christ in Revelation, I don't want to completely rule out that this could be a very majestic angelic being that is appearing to Daniel. Either possibility could raise its own set of questions, but in the end, I'd have to say to you, we don't absolutely know. I'm not going to tell you I absolutely know for sure this was Jesus or it wasn't. I'm saying it could be. It could be. And I don't think knowing the exact identity of the being is really significant enough to alter our understanding of the passage. So maybe it's okay that we don't know exactly. I think if it mattered that we had to know exactly who the identity was, then God would have told us. I mean, if that was a thing that just was required to understand the passage. But it's fascinating, it's interesting, and I think there is the possibility that it seems to match up with the appearance of Jesus in Revelation. What's also fascinating is the behind-the-scenes look that this being gives to Daniel. He gives us an insight into the spiritual realms. Because Daniel's aware of the current events of the world around him. He knows what's happening in the kingdom. He knows about the politics of the world. He's an influential person in the government. But it's something entirely different when you know what's going on behind the scenes. And that's what we're going to kind of see this being reveals to Daniel today. Look again at verse 12. This is back to Daniel chapter 10, verse 12. This being appears to Daniel and he says, "Don't be afraid," he said to me, "for from the first day that you proposed to understand and to humble yourself before God, your prayers were heard. I have come because of your prayers." Guys, that's really good news. God hears prayers. Verse 13, "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me after I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Now I have come to help you understand what will happen to your people in the last days, for the vision refers to those days." So Daniel had this vision. He was deeply troubled by it, so much that he prayed. And by the way, that is the correct response. If you're troubled by something, pray. That's what you should do. Daniel's doing the right thing, and he's getting the right answer. God heard his prayers. In fact, it wasn't like God heard his prayers long after the fact. He didn't hear his prayers weeks later after the fact. He didn't even hear it when the prayers arrived. But it says here, the moment Daniel proposed to understand, the moment he proposed to humble his heart before God, the moment he proposed to pray, God was already on the case. He already knew what was coming. He had heard. He responded the moment he did it. And that is something to keep in mind. God is able to instantaneously respond the moment you get your heart humble before him. Why did it take 3 weeks for the answer to reach Daniel? Well, because this being was coming to Daniel in response to his prayers, was opposed, it says, by the prince of the kingdom of Persia. But Michael, one of the chief princes, it says, who we would recognize as an archangel, came to assist this messenger in that struggle. I think it's a very reasonable concept that if a message has been sent from God to Daniel and the angel Michael is the one supporting, the one delivering the message, then we should assume the prince of Persia who opposes this message being delivered is a form of evil spiritual principality. We're dealing with a spiritual warfare issue. We're getting an insight into what's going on in the heavens, this battle that's going on that takes place over the answer to Daniel's prayer. And it provides us an interesting behind-the-scenes look into spiritual warfare and how it interacts with prayer. It would seem that there are spiritual beings deliberately working against God and working against his will being done, yes, in the life of the individual, but also perhaps in the life of the nation. Guys, understand, Satan doesn't want your prayers answered. Okay, that's probably not a newsflash to any of you. Satan doesn't want your prayers answered. And we are in the middle of a spiritual battleground. In fact, Paul, the Apostle Paul, puts it this way. This is in Ephesians chapter 6, picking up in verse 10. He says, "Finally be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength. Put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil." And he is scheming, by the way. Verse 12, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavens." See, like Daniel, we live in a world that seems politically turbulent, that seems as though there's always trouble over the next horizon, and it seems like we have human enemies that lie beyond our borders of our nation, and we worry about that. But understand, what we don't see is the behind-the-scenes battle, the spiritual battle that is being waged in the heavens that will determine our future. Now, I have good news for you on that front. It may often look in the world like the good guys are losing. Sometimes, does it seem that way? You feel like the good guys aren't making such good headway? But I can assure you, behind the scenes, God isn't going to lose the spiritual battle. God will be victorious. He has already determined our destiny, and his plans will be fulfilled. The Prince of Persia opposed this message getting to Daniel, but he didn't get to stop it. God saw it through. And nonetheless, we should take seriously this behind-the-scenes spiritual battle and put on the full armor of God, as Paul tells us, because it is God's strength that will win the battle. In fact, even in today's passage, while Daniel was praying, heaven was at war on his behalf. Daniel didn't have to go to war to fight this battle. It was God's army that was at war fighting this battle. It was Michael, the angel, who goes to fight this battle. It was this being who comes and speaks to Daniel who fought this battle. I think we're also seeing in this passage a dynamic that these spiritual powers in the heavens are being the power behind political entities we have to see and deal with in the physical world. Look again at verse 20 and 21. And actually we'll look at verse 1 of chapter 11. The being speaking to Daniel, he says this, "Do you know why I've come to you? I must return at once to fight against the Prince of Persia." He's going back to engage in that spiritual battle. "When I leave, the Prince of Greece will come. However, I will tell you what is recorded in the book of truth. No one has the courage to support me against those princes except Michael, your prince. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to strengthen and protect him. The being that appears to Daniel talks about the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece, Michael, your prince, which would be the prince of Israel. We can kind of see that as we go into the next chapter. We know Michael by name as the archangel, who kind of is over the nation of Israel. And we see him in other places in Scripture in the New Testament. However, we're not really told the names of these other princes, these more demonic type beings, angelic beings perhaps, that are on the dark side. Since they're fighting against Michael, we'd have to assume they're demonic, that they're bad angels. And that brings up a whole interesting understanding of the behind-the-scenes spiritual forces at a national level. Now, see, you guys get really quiet here, because I think we like to think of things in the physical world being separated from the spiritual world. We'd like to think we're in control of our own nation or our own destiny. But I'm going to tell you, there is a spiritual fight taking place in the background. And that's kind of what we're seeing here, is these behind-the-scenes forces were engaging at a national level. Most people seem to believe in the concept maybe of a guardian angel. You know, there's an angel God has assigned to protect me, and it's wonderful. They protect me. They keep me out of trouble. Some of your angels are really high-stressed. You're on vacation? Okay. Or maybe we even see the concept, of both sides trying to influence the good and evil. Now, you've seen the cartoons where you got the little angel on one shoulder and the little devil on the other, and they're both trying to convince you, what to do. In this passage, we might be seeing something of the concept of that, maybe as for the nations as a whole. A guardian angel for a nation. Or even angelic and demonic forces at war over the destiny or soul of a nation. Which way is it going to go? Does each nation have a spiritual force over it, behind its political power? Now that's a scary question, because if so, which side is our nation on? What battle is taking place for our nation? Are we as a nation on God's side, or are we one of those nations fighting against God's plan on earth? And let me just tell you up front, to give you a good clue, most nations are on the devil's side. Most. In fact, what we see in this passage is the only one willing to fight on the side of God's plan was Michael for the Prince of Israel. One nation out of all of them. That's pretty bad odds. Of course, understand, most people are on the devil's side too, so, think that through. Your national standing with God will be on the basis of your relationship with Christ. And I mean that as a nation, as our rulers, as our governors. This is Psalm chapter 2. I actually hit this week, and it's just kind of jumped out at me to fit into this passage, but it's, I think, gives us a powerful look into this dynamic. Psalm chapter 2, the psalmist writes this: "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain?" Do you know the nations are raging against God? They are. Verse 2, "The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and His anointed one. Let us tear off their chains and throw their ropes off of us." And get God's reaction here in verse 4. "The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord ridicules them. Then He speaks to them in His anger and terrifies them in His wrath. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will declare the Lord's decree, He said to me. You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with an iron scepter, and you will shatter them like pottery. So now, kings, be wise. He's speaking to the rulers of the earth. Be wise. Receive instruction, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with reverential awe and rejoice with trembling. Pay homage to the Son, or he will be angry, and you will perish in your rebellion. For his anger may ignite at a moment. All who take refuge in him are happy. Guys, the world is in continual rebellion against God and against his anointed one, Jesus. And by the way, Peter actually quotes this very passage in his sermon on the day of Pentecost as referring to Christ, if you want to know. The world constantly wants to throw off the chains that bind them to their Creator. We're not going to live the way God designed us to live. We're not going to live the way God says we have to live. We're going to do our own thing. They're determined to set their own course without God. We can fix all the problems. We don't need God's help. We don't need to listen to what God has to say. And mark my words, this battle is happening in our nation and in every other nation around the world, and it is, I think, about to escalate. We need to be praying. Guys, that's the response. We need to be praying. We need to pray for our nation. We need to pray that our nation will be found on God's side of the fight. Actually, years ago, this is probably before some of your time, Abraham Lincoln was in a press conference. Yeah, a couple of you weren't there. He was in a press conference, and a reporter actually said to him, "Mr. President, I'm so glad God is on our side." And Abraham Lincoln's response was, "Sir, I do not want God to be on our side. I want to be on God's side." Guys, we need to make sure it's not that we want God to come in and be on our side. We want to be on His side because He's the one that wins. Are we going to be on His side? We need to pray for the soul of our nation. We need to pray for the nations of the world that they would come to Christ and be blessed. Guys, we want God's blessing. We want them to come to Jesus. And the nations that rebel against God understand they are only pursuing their own destruction because Jesus is King and He will reign over the earth. We've read the end of the book. In fact, we've studied the book of Revelation together, many of us. We know how it ends. Jesus comes back. He's going to reign over the earth. And the nations will bow before Him. Nonetheless, the nations do rage against God on the losing side of a spiritual war that is ongoing. Behind the scenes, there are demonic and angelic powers battling over us, and yet the final outcome of those battles, understand, has already been determined by God. We know who wins the war. Battles continue, but we already know who wins the war. In fact, you might think about this. There came a turning point in World War II where the Axis knew they had lost. The Allies knew they had won. Did that mean the war was over? No. They kept fighting. See, you can keep fighting a war even when you know you've lost, and that's where the devil is right now. Jesus won 2,000 years ago on the cross. Jesus won at the tomb when He walked out of it alive. Jesus has already won the victory, but the war is continuing until He returns for the final victory. Victory is assured. It's been determined by God. And where do we stand? Where will our nation stand? For God, will we stand for God so that we can be blessed? And I hope so. I mean, we have, as a nation, we have a godly heritage. We celebrate God's blessing upon us. And I'm grateful for that. Because I'm going to tell you, God has blessed us. And I hope we will stand, like Abraham Lincoln said, we will be on God's side. But we do have the choice. We can stand against Him. There is a spiritual battle taking place to turn us against Him. And I'll tell you, every nation that is against God will eventually be destroyed. So I think it's a good question we should always be pondering, asking ourselves, am I on God's side? Are we on God's side? Now, in the case of Persia, the truth is they really were against God, and Greece was going to be used by God to come and destroy them. We looked at that in some of Daniel's other visions. We looked at that actually even in King Nebuchadnezzar's visions that Daniel interpreted, and we'll see more details of that next week of what Daniel's upsetting vision was because how it had impacted God's people. What I think we should walk away from this passage, we should walk away with the knowledge that there is a battle behind the scenes. There's a behind-the-scenes spiritual battle taking place where the forces of evil are working against God's plan for the world. And the forces of good are working to accomplish God's plans. And in the end, God's plans will be carried out. The battle continues, but we know how it ends. Don't just take the world at face value. Approach everything with the understanding that there is a spiritual component to the world we live in. We should stay cognizant of the fact that there is that spiritual battle taking place behind the scenes. The wars and political movements of this world have spiritual backgrounds. Guys, I'm going to tell you, I am convinced that Nazi Germany was satanic. Now, most of you probably wouldn't argue with me on that, because if you study your history, you'd probably agree. But I'm convinced of it. I don't think it was just a political movement. I believe it was a spiritual evil that was behind what happened. That's right. Well, guys, there's other spiritual evils in the world behind what happens. We should pay attention to that. I think the communists who have killed millions in Russia, millions in China, there's a spiritual evil behind that. We need to be cognizant of these spiritual dynamics. And the wars and political movements that happen around the world, there's something behind them. And we need to be careful in every situation to make sure we are on God's side. Now, a second thing I think we can walk away from this passage is we should recognize that God hears and answers prayer. Guys, God hears your prayers. God answers your prayers. And if your prayer seems a long time in the answer coming, it may be that there's a spiritual battle going on delaying your answer. It doesn't mean that God didn't hear you. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care about you. It doesn't even mean that God hasn't answered. It means you need to keep on praying. Keep on praying until your answers come. Don't give up. Keep on praying until God answers. Actually, I think the way Jesus said it in His teaching was, keep on knocking and the door will be opened. Keep on asking and the answer will come. Jesus said, don't give up. Keep praying. Be persistent in your prayers. And instead of giving up, pound on the door of heaven until God's answer arrives. That's what we should do. That's what Daniel did. He prayed for 3 weeks. He prayed for 3 weeks. Guys, most of us have spiritual ADD. Okay? We have trouble keeping focus for 3 minutes. We need to focus on God and not let go. And another thing I think this passage should do for us, it should make us clear to us that because God does answer prayer, we should pray. Guys, we should pray. We pass by so many opportunities to pray. The world's a mess. Now, you probably already knew that. I mean, it's a mess out there. You turn on the news, it's just a mess. The nations are raging against God. They're raging against His anointed. They're raging against His people. They're raging and full of hatred towards anything that's godly. The world hates Christ. The world hates the nation of Israel. And I think right now, for us as a nation, maybe you've seen this in the news. You hear anything about China being hostile to us at all? How about Russia? Anybody hear about Russia being maybe just a little bit uppity with us? How about Islamic terrorists? Any of those mad at us right now? See, I think sometimes we feel like we are just surrounded and we fear the enemies on every side. Well, what do? I'm going to tell you, pray. because our God is more powerful than their army. Pray. Pray, because the battle is the Lord's. It's a spiritual battle that's taking place in the heavens. And it is maybe beyond our control. Guys, there's nothing there's nothing I can do about it. But there is someone who can. Because it is not beyond God's control. And what I can do is I can pray. I can take it to the throne of heaven. I can put it in God's hands. Now, are there things happening in the world that we don't understand or maybe that overwhelm us? Yes, well, then the answer is pray. Is the spiritual battle grinding on you? Maybe you feel weak. Maybe you're tired. You feel beat up this week? I don't know, I feel beat up. I got my second COVID shot, so maybe that's why I feel beat up. but you feel beat up this week? You know what you should do? If you're under spiritual attack, pray. Pray. Guys, I wasn't joking about spiritual warfare. As I'm preparing for this particular message, I've had 2 tablets go down on me, and so I'm working off printed notes. The other thing I've learned about the devil is don't give up, because, stay a step ahead. Are you concerned with the future of our nation, the future of our world, the future of your community, the future of your family? Are you concerned about that? Then the answer is pray. Pray for those things. Bring it to the throne of heaven and keep bringing it to God until He answers. See, we keep on praying. And I'll tell you what, if you keep on praying, God will answer. The forces of heaven are waging war against the forces of darkness, and the day will come where we will see God's victory. Christ Jesus will appear, the sky will split open, He will return, His kingdom will be established. But from here until there, it is our job to pray.